What's good, family? And welcome back to the dinner table. If you're new here, come on in, sit down, get comfortable, grab yourself a glass of wine, and let's get into this week's case. So, this week at the dinner table, I'm going to do something kind of opposite of the case that I did the last two episodes with Samuel Little. So, with Samuel Little's case, he was tried multiple times, and each time he would get off because all they had was circumstantial evidence against him. So they weren't able to get a solid conviction until years after his murders. Well, in this week's case, I'm going to be telling you about a 16-year-old boy who could have possibly been wrongly convicted due to circumstantial evidence. All they had was a handwritten scribbled note, the smoking gun, and what seemed to be biased law enforcement. So after doing all the research, I know where I stand. But I want to hear where you guys stand after hearing all the facts of this case.
That's what it's all about. Guns and butter, baby.
Now, I know the people we discuss here at the dinner table aren't the only ones who fly off the rails and lose their tempers, diving headfirst into a murder charge. If you find yourself going down a rabbit hole of uncontrollable emotions and you just can't get a grip, then let the sponsor of this episode, BetterHelp, help you. BetterHelp will connect you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen to all your intrusive thoughts and give you helpful, unbiased advice to keep you stable. It could all be so simple. Use the link listed in my show notes using the promo code KINDAG and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Get matched with the therapist selected just for you, usually in as little as just 48 hours. You can have your therapist right at your fingertips using your phone or computer, a phone call, video chat, and even messaging, whichever you prefer. Use the link in my show notes and get 10% off your first month of therapy right from the comfort of your home. So this week at the dinner table, I'm going to be telling you guys about the double murders of former NFL player Antonio Armstrong and his beautiful wife, Dawn Armstrong. Antonio Donnell Armstrong was born October 15, 1973, to his parents Don and Kay Armstrong in Houston, Texas. He had 4 siblings, and they were all raised in the church. After graduating from high school in the early 90s, he went on to play college football for Texas A&M. And in 1995, in the 6th round of the NFL draft, he was drafted to the San Francisco 49ers. He later went on to be traded to the Miami Dolphins, and unfortunately, his career in the NFL didn't last long due to an ankle injury. But y'all know how it is when you have a passion for something. You're not going to let your dreams fall to the wayside that easily, especially for athletes, and especially for Antonio. So he kept fighting through his ankle injury, and he went on to play for the Canadian Football League for 5 seasons. Now, while he's out in Canada pursuing his football career, he meets the apple of his eye, Miss Dawn Whitley. Now, Dawn was born February 17, 1974, to her parents Keith and Ramona Whitley in Atchison, Kansas. She loved all things health and fitness, and because of that, she and Antonio just clicked instantly. So Dawn already had a young son by the name of Josh, but after she and Antonio got married, Antonio ended up adopting Josh and raising him as his own. The two of them did eventually have 2 more children of their own. Antonio Jr., or AJ, who was born in Canada, and when they moved back to the States, they had their daughter Kayra. Back in the States, Antonio moves his family back to his hometown of Houston, and they resided right outside of Houston in the city of Bel Air. While in Houston, the couple goes on to open up their very own gym called First Class Training Gym. And they were doing pretty well for themselves, being successful Black business owners in Houston. So they went ahead and opened up a few more gyms. And they just seemed like they were happy, living their life, financially stable. Everything was going good for the family. And from the outside looking in, they were pretty much a true Texan, all-American Black family. And their lives revolved heavily around their faith, family, and football. Those are pretty much the 3 F's of being a Texan. Not only that, but Antonio was a great father and role model for his children. He coached his son AJ while he played basketball, football, and even ran track. So he was an all-around athlete himself, seeming to follow along in his father's footsteps. So after his football career ended, along with opening up his gyms, Antonio went on to become a motivational speaker. He even started his own YouTube channel called Strong Talk. Not only that, but he was an associate pastor at his mother's church. And Don and Antonio were just growing in their love for one another. For real, they were couple goals. Successful, black, financially stable. They had 3 beautiful kids. And everything seemed to be going smooth for the family. And on July 24th, 2016, Dawn posts a picture of her wedding day on Facebook. And it reads, quote, "This guy is my everything. He completes me in every way. He's my best friend after almost 2 decades. It's the simple things that make us happy." I know that's right, Dawn. She loved her man, okay? And just 5 days after making this post, Dawn and Antonio's dreams of happiness and success was senselessly stripped from them when they were murdered in their beds while they slept peacefully.
911, do you need medical, police, or fire?
Going to be police, people whispering, advising you just heard gunshots in the parents' room.
Is this a house?
Yes.
And your name?
AJ?
Any medical attention needed?
I heard gunshots, so I don't really know.
In your parents' bedroom?
Yes.
On the early Sunday morning of July 29th, 2016, 16-year-old AJ calls 911, and as you can hear from the police call, he's whispering. That's because he was in his closet hiding. He's telling the dispatcher that he heard gunshots coming from his parents' room. When officers arrived to the home on Palmetto Street, they quickly set up a perimeter around the residence. All at the same time, AJ was still inside on the phone with the dispatcher. While taking direction from the dispatcher, not knowing if the intruder is still in the house, AJ creeps down the hall to his 12-year-old sister Kayra's room. The dispatcher could hear him tell her, quote, "I heard gunshots in Mom and Dad's room. We gotta go outside. The police are here." AJ then walks her down to the first floor, disalarms the alarm system, and lets the officers in. When the officers meet the children at the front door, they immediately take them away to safety and begin clearing the home. Once inside, police find both Dawn and Antonio in unspeakable conditions in their bedroom, suffering from apparent gunshot wounds. They were surrounded by blood, and both had been shot at close range through pillows that had been placed over their heads, and shell casings from a .22 caliber were found on the floor around them. Dawn was found on the floor of the master bedroom. She was shot twice in the head, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. Next to her, on the right side of the bed, laid her sweet husband Antonio, the love of her life. But unlike her, Antonio was still alive, fighting for his life with a gunshot wound to his head. He luckily made it to the hospital, but later died of his injuries. So since Antonio succumbed to his injuries, the charges of this heinous crime were upgraded to capital murder. So capital murder is a type of first-degree murder, but it involves aggravating circumstances. And it's punishable by death or even life in prison without the possibility of parole. And investigators were working expeditiously to catch their killers. So back at the crime scene, time was ticking, and the investigation was already in full motion. For starters, investigators find out that the couple had been killed with their own gun. And the gun was found on the first floor in the kitchen, right on the counter in plain sight. So the gun was Antonio's .22 caliber handgun, and it was still warm to the touch. And next to it was a scribbled note that reads, quote, "I've been watching you. Come get me." Officers soon realized that the note was written or scribbled on a piece of paper from a pad found in the kitchen drawers. Not only that, but they find out that Antonio usually kept his gun in the nightstand drawer by his bed. So right off the bat, they assume the killer had to have been someone who knew the gun was in the nightstand, or at least somebody who was familiar with the family home. Now this is a nice neighborhood and all, but let's not forget we're still in Texas. So not only did the family protect themselves with the gun, they also armed themselves with an alarm system. And investigators noticed that the alarm system was armed and active throughout the night, and it hadn't been triggered by anyone trying to break in. You see, on the night of July 28th, the Armstrongs set their alarm at 9:52 p.m., and it was set for the stay setting, which meant that all the doors and windows were monitored in case of a break-in. Now, the setting allowed for movement inside of the house, of course, but just as an effective alarm works, it was set to go off if anyone from the outside comes inside. So the only people home that night were Dawn and Antonio, who were in their bedroom on the second floor, their 12-year-old daughter Kayra, whose bedroom was on the opposite end of the second floor, and AJ, whose bedroom was on the third floor. So with this information, investigators now have to ask themselves, with only 4 people being in the home, Antonio, Dawn, Kayra, and AJ, and the home's alarm system was on and active during the time the murders occurred. Yet the alarm never went off. So was there really an intruder? Or was the killer already in the house? So in the study just outside the master bedroom, investigators noticed a bullet hole in the ceiling. And when they went to the third floor, which was the loft where AJ's room was, they find the source of the bullet hole, which is coming from a hole in AJ's room floor. Now the bullet hole in his room was covered by a pile of socks. And on the second floor, they also find an area of carpet that looked like it had been burned. So while collecting as much evidence from the family home as they could, one of the detectives, Sergeant John Herlisha, says that by this time, he was starting to get a feeling that there was never an intruder in the Armstrong home. You see, there was no signs of forced entry anywhere in the home. There was also no broken doors or windows, and no signs of any type of scuffle inside of the bedroom. Everything in the home looked as if it was in its correct place, so this wasn't a robbery. So after gathering as much information as possible in order to kick off the investigation to solve this double murder, we all know how alarm systems work though. They're going to work most effectively if somebody enters from the outside. So the alarms were set, but they never sounded. So at this time, officers outside the home separate AJ and his sister, and all fingers are pointing to the killer coming from inside. So down at the police station, and within 10 minutes of being questioned, AJ was already being read his rights, and questioning him was Sergeant Kenneth Dagnell and investigator Jimmy Dotson. So the murder was said to have taken place somewhere at 1 a.m. in the morning. And by the time they started questioning AJ, it was around 7:45 a.m. So y'all, let's not forget that AJ's only 16 years old, and they just pretty much arrested him for the murder of his parents. So after reading him his rights, they start off by asking him about the dynamics of his family. So AJ answers back by telling the officers that he and his dad were really close, and he and his siblings did have some issues with their mom, but it was nothing big, just family stuff. He lets them know that in addition to he and his sister Kayra, he also has an older brother by the name of Josh. So at the time, Josh was 20 years old, and although he had moved out of the family home, he was still really close. He lived right up the street. AJ was then asked what he seen or heard the night of the murders. So he tells him that he hadn't been feeling well the day before, and that he, his parents, and his sister were all in the house by 9 p.m. He says that around 1 or 2 a.m. he heard his parents' room door open, which typically means one of them is getting up to go get a snack or something. So he went down to the second floor so he could ask whichever one of his parents it was in the kitchen for some medicine. But that's when he heard 2 gunshots and he saw a man wearing a mask running away. So he turned back around, ran back up the stairs, and hid in his closet to call 911. He goes on to let them know that his dad owned a gun, but he himself had only used the gun once, and that was while they were at a shooting range and he was around 8 years old. So it's at this time when Sergeant Dagnell used this opportunity to ask him about the bullet hole they found in the ceiling that matched the hole in his room floor. And this is when AJ's story starts to get a little bit questionable. He asked them, "There's a bullet hole in the ceiling?" And the detective said, "Yes. It looks like a fresh bullet hole too." So AJ then changes his story from only touching the gun once when he was 8 at a gun range to saying he touched the gun a few weeks ago. He said he laid some pillows and a blanket on the floor to stop the bullet from going through, but instead the shot went through the pillow and the blankets and through the floor. So by this time, the fingers are starting to point towards AJ more and more. But he still swore he never touched the gun the night before. So Sergeant Dagnall then asked him how an intruder would have time to leave the gun on the kitchen counter, write a note, then get out before the police arrive. Now, AJ did agree that his story sounded a little bit off, and he says he doesn't understand how somebody could have gotten out of the house or gotten in for that matter. And when he was asked about the statement he made on the 911 call when he says, quote, "It's all my fault," he said by this, he meant he felt guilty for not doing anything when he saw the intruder. So at this point, detectives are being detectives, and they're not letting up on AJ. Instead, Dotson insisted that no one came in the house that night, and then he points out how calm AJ's demeanor was, even under such tragic circumstances. So in regard to his calm demeanor, AJ responds by saying he had been crying earlier, but his brother Josh had calmed him down. And regarding the burn mark in the second floor stairway, AJ said that it was something that he and his dad had already argued about, and that he had been playing with the match a few days earlier and the carpet caught on fire. He said that he had lied to his dad at first, but they had talked about it and they worked it out. And he also says that when he and his dad had problems, they always sat down and solved them. So detectives are like, all right, AJ, so if we were to test you for gunshot residue, we wouldn't find anything on your hands or clothes? And AJ's like, no, you wouldn't find any gunpowder there. Nothing like that would come back on me. He says, I had nothing to do with this. He goes on to tell him that he understands how this makes him look. And even his brother Josh told him that his story didn't make any sense. But despite his denials, AJ was still arrested and charged with murder. But because he was only 16 at the time, he was taken to Harris County Juvenile Detention Center. And in the state of Texas, capital murder is reserved for certain types of homicides, such as killing more than one person at a time. So you know what that meant? He was being charged with capital murder. A week after Antonio and Dawn were killed, a funeral was held for them, and AJ was luckily allowed to attend. He was still handcuffed, but he was there nonetheless. Now, close to 3,000 people showed up to this service. Can you believe that? 3,000 people? So AJ was denied bail and he remained in custody at the Juvenile Detention Center. But in March of 2017, 8 months after the double murders, a judge finally decided that he was going to be tried as an adult. So according to the order, the court took many factors into consideration when making the decision to try him as an adult. Some of the testimony that had been presented by the prosecution had to do with AJ's prior behavior. You see, AJ had reportedly been kicked out of his private school due to poor grades, and he had to start attending public school as a result. But his life in public school wasn't a walk in the park like private school was. Unlike in private school, he didn't make the starting roster for the football team in public school. And he was getting into more trouble with his parents because he was smoking weed. And before their deaths, he had reportedly had his car and cell phone taken. So the judge writes that there was probable cause to believe that he had committed the crime. The judge goes on to say that it appears that he planned certain aspects of the crime in practicing with the handgun used to kill his parents while he was in his bedroom when he fired it through a pillow and comforter. So his name was then released to the public and he was transferred to the Harris County Jail. And at this time, he was facing life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving 40 years if he was convicted. But just a month later in April, the judge decides to have a little bit of leniency on AJ, and he grants him a $200,000 bond. And after months in custody, he was able to go home. Now, he was on house arrest and he had to wear an ankle monitor, but he did get to go home. So as his trial date approached, in June of 2018, his attorneys filed a motion to have the case completely dismissed. They claimed there was a witness who came forward in 2016, and the prosecutors were just now giving the defense an audio tape of the interview, just one day before the trial was set to begin. His attorney said that they were initially told that this particular lead was investigated, and that it wasn't credible, that the investigation was complete and there was nothing more to see. But now, 18 months in, They're now handing over an audio tape from an interview that they never told the defense existed. So back in 2016, 5 months after the murders, a witness and family friend by the name of Maxine Adams comes forward and tells him that Antonio was involved in some prostitution ring. Now, according to the defense's motion, Maxine told police that there was at least 5 people in this ring, including Antonio. Maxine goes on to tell them that Dawn hired a private investigator to look into her husband's involvement into this ring. She does give the police the names and numbers of the people that were said to be involved in this ring. So she also says that Antonio had been receiving death threats in the months prior to the murders, and that he had recently changed his life insurance policy because he was afraid something would happen to him. So AJ's attorney said that the fact that the prosecutors kept this from them for so long violated their client's constitutional right to a fair trial. So to this, the DA basically says, look, we're not going to dismiss any charges. What we can do is delay the trial and give you guys more time to look into these allegations. So after looking into the allegations made by Maxine, it was ultimately determined that the motion to dismiss the case was denied. Instead, the trial was rescheduled for a year later. So, in April of 2019, 3 years after the murders occurred, AJ's trial finally begins. And nearly everyone who knew AJ and who knew the Armstrong family was standing behind him. And at his first hearing, AJ stood in front of the court wearing a green prison-issue jumpsuit. Defending him was attorney Rich DeToto, and he wanted to show the jury just how biased the Houston Police Department was and how they never looked at any other suspects, so that left room for reasonable doubt. In his opening statement, DeToto begins by telling the jury that within minutes of arriving at the Armstrong home, the Houston Police Department had already made up their minds about who their suspect was. And with no DNA evidence, no blood splatter, no gunshot residue on him, within 11 minutes, he was arrested. He goes on to say that none of AJ's fingerprints were found on the weapon, the shells, the magazine, bullets, the slide, nothing. And that Dawn and Antonio were shot at close range. So, if it had been AJ, so why was there no blood splatter on any of his clothing, any of his belongings, nothing? DeToto goes on to say that there was something else that was never looked into, but it was relevant to the case. Shortly after Antonio and Dawn passed away, their gym was broken into. So the surveillance video shows 2 men wearing hoodies, smashing the windows, and rummaging around inside, looking for something. Now, why is this important, he asked? Because AJ told police that there was a masked man in the house the night his parents were murdered. So again, reasonable doubt. So the prosecution starts off by talking about the alarm system and how the house was pretty much closed up for the night. All the windows, all the doors, everything was locked. But at around 1:09 a.m., the upstairs motion detector went off. He said that that's important because none of the doors were open, none of the windows were open, and the downstairs motion detector didn't go off at the time. He said that nobody came from the first floor, but the motion occurred on the second floor. So when AJ came down from his room on the 3rd floor, he got on the stairs and the motion detector caught him. He said that 16 minutes later at 1:25 a.m., the downstairs motion detector went off. Still, no doors, no windows, nothing was open. He says the killer walked from the 2nd story down to the 1st story. And y'all remember where the gun was left, right? In the kitchen on the 1st floor. He said the 911 call was made at 1:40 a.m. So what happened between 1:09 and 1:40? He says that's enough time to write a note, put the gun downstairs, change clothes, and do whatever else needs to be done to cover up the crime scene. The prosecution closes out opening statements by saying the alarm couldn't protect them because they were going to be killed by their own child. So throughout the trial, text messages between AJ and his parents were combed through. So the prosecution says that after AJ failed out of private school, his mom had caught him smoking weed, drinking, and apparently he was a habitual liar. So in one of the text messages, Dawn says how disappointed she is in him. And in October of 2015, Dawn texted AJ saying, "You can't start slacking. You work too hard." But in April of 2016, Antonio texted him saying, AJ, I am sick of getting reports about the silly crap you're doing. Keep screwing up and doing silly things like speeding through the park, and I'm trading your car in for one that fits your maturity. Last warning. But the defense wanted to point out that he wasn't the only child who was a disappointment to his parents. His older brother Josh, who had just failed out of college, also had access to the home. So the defense was basically trying to allude to the fact that Josh was never a suspect, but they were basically trying to pin the murders on him instead of AJ. And during the trial, AJ openly cried at the defense table while listening to some of the testimonies. And during the closing arguments, the prosecution says, AJ didn't explode. He planned and practiced it and lied about it. The defendant is guilty, ladies and gentlemen. You didn't do it. I didn't do it. They didn't do it. He did it. That's your decision. You need to tell him that you know the manipulation is over. The lying is over. You didn't fall for it. And after nearly 20 hours of deliberation, the jury could not reach a verdict. They were deadlocked, so the judge had to declare a mistrial. So AJ's second trial began in October of 2022. He was 22 years old, and he had been on house arrest for the past 5 years. So all the same evidence and all the testimony and witnesses was presented in front of a new jury, yet again. But this time around, the defense really wanted to hone in on Josh as a suspect. They went on to talk about how he was schizophrenic, how he had access to the house, he only lived a couple blocks away, so on and so forth. But during the second trial, the defense wanted to subpoena more medical evidence to see if there was something they were missing. And after 17 hours and 58 minutes, for the second time, the jury was deadlocked, so the prosecution pushed for another mistrial. So in July of 2023, 7 years after the murders, AJ's third trial begins. So from 2016 to the time of the second trial in 2022, there was still no blood evidence ever recovered on any of AJ's belongings or his clothing. But during this trial, a blood pattern analyst by the name of Sergeant Celestina Rossi was brought in by the prosecution to look over physical evidence, and she examined that a visitor's badge sticker that was placed on AJ's shirt when he was first questioned by the police at the station had, quote, small reddish-brown circular stains on the back side of the sticker, and preliminary tests indicated that it was blood. So she took the evidence to the Houston Forensic Science Center for further analysis, and it was determined that the stain was identified as a single source belonging to Antonio. But his defense came back and argued that the presence of blood on his shirt could have been a result of cross-contamination. He says, quote, it's very possible that those specks of blood got under the sticker through the handling of evidence. But after both sides rested yet again, after 7 years and 10 hours of deliberating, the jury had finally reached a verdict. Drum roll, please. Guilty. Damn, AJ. So he was immediately sentenced to life in prison. And because he was a juvenile during the time of the crime, he would be eligible for parole after 40 years. So immediately following the verdict, he did file for an appeal. But as of right now, he's serving out his life sentence in the Robertson unit in Abilene. It's about 6 hours away from Houston. Damn, y'all. 7 long years and they found him guilty. What do y'all think? Because I'm not even going to lie, I think he did it. I think they got the right person and he deserves his life sentence because you killed your parents for no reason at all. Like, you can't even tell us why. I'll tell you why, though. It was because he was spoiled and his parents wouldn't let him have his way anymore. And he just kept getting caught in lie after lie. So he felt like the only way he can gain his control back was to kill his parents. But I want to know what you guys think. Join my Guns and Butter discussion group on Facebook and let me know what you guys are thinking about this case. Do you think they have the right person behind bars or do you think AJ is innocent? But all right, cousins, that's going to do it for this week's case. I hope you guys enjoyed, and as usual, I'll see you guys back here, same place, same time next week.